Our presentation today is Joey Slowik. He's with the IPM program here at the Cooperative Extension Service within IANRI at UAF, and he's going to be talking about slugs, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Joey.
Cool. Good morning, everybody. Sorry I'm not there in person, but I was there for 4 days for the invasive species meeting, and so I think besides moving into Pikes, I think it was best for me to head back to Palmer. Again, my name is Joey Slowik. I'm the Integrated Pest Management Technician down here in Palmer. And if you don't know where that is, it's on the Matanuska Experimental Farm, kind of behind the hospital there on Trunk Road. Oh, let's see if we can make it click. So for those that aren't really familiar with part of the full extent of what extension does, we really function as this kind of middle ground between the largely esoteric science, not necessarily largely, but a lot of the esoteric science that the university does, as well as the industrial side of what's going on. And so for us, especially, we have soil scientists that are looking at, microorganisms and potassium counts in the soil, but how that relates to what's happening and how farmers are actually using that information is we're sort of that middle bound to try to work and help to educate farmers on what some of that esoteric science is. We also do quite a bit of small scale experiments. And so these are sort of things and research that goes on in other states, and seeing if those lessons that are those things that are happening in other states can be adapted to Alaska. So like a good idea of this is our variety trials, right? We do this every year. We grow all kinds of various things from cauliflower and broccoli and kale, et cetera. And we see if they do well in Alaska. We often collect data in a scientific manner, of course, because we are a scientific institution, and this allows us to provide informed recommendations. But the data of these smaller scale experiments don't give us enough information to really tease out why. So for example, with our variety trial, not to pick on Glenna, but a good example is, our variety trial. So we grow all kinds of cauliflower, and we can tell you what varieties of cauliflower did well in Alaska. We can't tell you why that variety of cauliflower did well in Alaska, right? So we're allowed to give you advice, we're allowed to give you recommendations, but we don't know the big picture. And largely we just do these smaller experiments. So that leads to where we started with our slug process. 3 years ago, we realized that we had some major data gaps in slugs as a pest. We didn't know what species occurred in the state. We didn't know where they occurred. We didn't know what species were doing damage and whether they were really doing significant damage. We started the Alaska Slug and Snail Watch, which is you can access on our webpage, alaskapestreporter.org, but you can also post pictures to iNaturalist. We comb through all those looking for posts on various slug sightings and snail sightings across the state. Since we started 3 years ago, we've had over 300 reports from across the state, so it's been fairly active, and we've gotten a lot of good information out of it. We've documented 10 different species of slugs in the state, but we've also worked with partners in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia to identify 5 other species that we should really be on the watch for. And so these are pest species that occur in those states often and have the potential to be transported into our state, often through like the nursery trade or just transport, because a lot of things are coming and going out of Alaska. Since we started this, we found a couple invasive snail species found on Kodiak. Both of these are fairly large horticultural snails. One was found by like a mailbox, so we're assuming there's probably a population of that snail, and then the other was like a single occurrence that came in a container. We've also found an invasive slug that was not in Kodiak, and it was found by a master gardener who, thanks to our education and outreach operation, killed the slug right away. It was found at the Lowe's in Wasilla. So, reaching out to people about the dangers of invasive slugs has definitely helped us to have volunteers work as vectors to stop invasives from getting into the state. So to give you an idea what some of that data kind of looks like, thanks to this information, we now have a pretty good map of where we find our Aryan slugs. These are often called hedgehog slugs. If you've heard of the black slug, that occurs throughout Southeast Alaska, but also a more common dusky slug. This is a common garden pest for many gardeners, especially in the Anchorage-Wasilla area, but all the way out through the Aleutian chain. These slugs are fairly large, they're very damaging, and they can be incredibly numerous. So this gives us a good map of where we're seeing those slugs, and we're really focusing on where we find those animals, but it gives us some information on the ecological habitats where we might find them. Our gray garden slug is another one of our very common pest species. This is a cosmopolitan species, so it occurs pretty much everywhere in the world. Anywhere somebody is attempting to garden, this slug seems to find its way. We get from our data and talking to people, we're aware that this slug has sort of jumped over the Alaska range within about the last 10 years. Many people in Fairbanks report never seeing slugs, and so we still get a lot of those calls where it's, I've never seen slugs before, and all of a sudden I have these slugs. And so, this is a new incidence, why it took so long for this slug to kind of get over the Alaska range. We have reports of this slug in the Matsu Valley from the 20s. So we know that it was well established in the more agricultural areas, long ago, but why it took so long to get up to Fairbanks, nobody knows. But, this is the kind of information we're preening from these reports that people tell us. It also includes the meadow slug, which we think to be a native slug. That's the slug on the right-hand side, that darker slug. It's about 2/3 the size of a gray garden slug. And they generally aren't very damaging, but they can be fairly numerous. We also have another group of slugs we think are probably native. These are called tail dropper slugs or keeled slugs. If you look at the back of that slug on the left-hand side, you can kind of see that light mark running down its back, and that's often referred to as a keel. And these we think are probably native to the state. They occur across the state. They can be pesty. If they get high enough numbers, like Kodiak, they will definitely be a pest. And they'll often attack mushrooms. So we often hear from a lot of mushroom foragers when they're out looking for mushrooms that their best spot got hammered by a million of these tail dropper slugs. So from this data, we've been able to tease out slug phenology in the state, and this pretty much holds for all of our pest species that are being reported. So we understand that slugs are not making it through the winter, except in the very southern part of their range. They're overwintering as an egg. The young are hatching in the spring. They spend a good portion of their young life in the soil, so you don't really see young slugs very often. As they grow and become more confident, they emerge from the soil and feed on above ground plants. Temperate climates, like I mentioned before, like Ketchikan, southern Prince of Wales, into Wrangell, will have some adults over winter, and mild winters will also play a factor in whether adults survive. We're still lacking a lot of data on our native slugs. We don't have a full grasp on where our banana slugs occur across the strait or what their phenology is. They're a fairly large slug. They're fairly long-lived for a couple of years, but we don't really know how they're overwintering, or if that's why we don't see more banana slugs, up into the Anchorage area. Tail droppers, similar story there. We will get reports when they become pesty, but we don't get many reports outside of that. So, we still have a lot to learn about slugs in Alaska. And we really have no data on one of the common questions we're asked, which is, are these non-native, potentially invasive slugs impacting our native slugs or impacting our environment? And we really just have no data on that whatsoever to tell us one way or another. So why do we do farm experiments? Like I mentioned in that first slide, we have data gaps. We like to recommend what works. And it's important for us to make those recommendations off of scientifically validated data. So there's a lot of speculation on what works and doesn't work for slugs. It's pretty amazing. I think they're one of the probably most gossiped pests on the internet. Slugs are, and I think the reason behind this is that slugs are generally, they're generalists. They feed on a wide variety of plants and mushrooms and bacteria and all kinds of stuff, but they're also very adaptive. Slugs are very flexible in their environment and the areas they can live and what they can tolerate. And there's also a big chunk of diversity in the evolutionary history of slugs. And so if you think about those two pest species I talked about, the black slugs, those larger black slugs, and our gray garden slugs, those slugs are very evolutionarily distant. So slugs obviously came from snails, where a snail lost a shell. But if you look at their evolutionary tree, there were very many different ancestors between those two slugs. So it's kind of about, if you compare slugs to birds, it would be like looking at a woodpecker and an eagle, and those two birds obviously behave very differently and respond very differently in the environment. And so even though those slugs have similar body plans, they behave and respond very differently to barriers and pesticides as well. So to give you an idea of some of the smaller slug experiments we've done over the years, we had a request from Fish and Wildlife Service where they were finding black slugs on some of the outer remote Aleutian Islands. So we did some saltwater tolerance experiments. We've done population estimations, some cold tolerance. We've done quite a few experiments with electric fences and whether it was possible to habituate slugs with electric fences, copper band fencing, metal fencing, which I'll talk a bit more about today. Water glass, which is a paintable chemical. It's actually a concrete sealer, but it had a potential as a barrier. I'll talk a bit more about today about plastic mulch because we've done some experiments with that this year. Last year, I talked a bit about some of our essential oil and ammonia pesticide experiments. We've done experiments with diatomaceous earth, as well as traditional pesticides like metaldehyde and copper sulfate. And then, with all of these experiments for us, because we are on a farm, our key is to kind of roll this into, what is the impact that slugs may be having, and that we will lack a lot of that data. And so if we can make an estimate through these experiments and extend them into, potential harvest damages, that's informative to us, but also maybe informative to potential growers. When we're dealing with slugs, obviously with most pests, an integrated pest management approach is really the best way to go about it. So we're always asked, how can I control slugs? The most important thing is make sure that you actually have slug damage. There's a lot of things that can cause slug damage, but you need to verify that you do have slugs. You're going to try to locate where that population is, and then think about how bad is the damage. Do I really need to do anything? Am I just seeing one or two slugs that are eating one or two leaves? Is it really a thing I need to worry about? Then, as you progress, think about, is there a way that you can work, fix this in a long-term solution? Could I change the design of my garden that'll prevent slugs from occurring and causing damage? And then, is the population or the damage bad enough that I actually need to take action? Do I need to think about pesticides? And so this is kind of a progress as we work through integrated pest management with thinking about the important factors of slug control. So obviously the first thing is, do you have slugs? And the easiest way to identify slugs is to get up early. We often recommend using a refuge trap. So this can be like a piece of asphalt shingle or a plywood board set near a plant that you think is being damaged by slugs. You flip over the board and you look for the slugs. Simple as that. It's important. You can also look for mucus if they're drier days. Slugs always leave a mucus trail. You often see it shining. And it's important to be aware of jumping to conclusions. Grasshopper and caterpillar damage can look very similar to slug damage. Slugs don't create damage that's, very, quickly identifiable as that is slug damage, unless it's covered by mucus. Birds can also do very similar damage. Slugs really like young seedling plants, and they will come out of the soil and mow down a seedling as if it was never there. Birds will do a very similar thing. Well, they'll just come along and nip off the tip of the seedling and it'll not be there. So it's important to identify our pests before you go after them. A couple of years ago, the question was, well, how many slugs do we really have? And so we did a couple experiments looking at trying to, quantify how many slugs there were. We did a mark recapture study. This is very similar to how you mark fish, same math that we use for our salmon population estimations. We had a controlled area of a pasture edge, about 1,400 square feet. We did a mark recapture. That picture on the right is what the dye looks like. In a slug, you inject a little drop of dye into, it's actually kind of like a plastic that glows under UV light. So then when we recapture them, so we collect all the slugs we can, we mark them, and then we release them back, and we come back about a week later and try to collect as many as we can. The idea being that the more you recollect, the closer you are to the true population number. Our estimates were about 33,000 slugs in that 1,400 square foot area. If you expand that to an acre, that works out to about 720 slugs per acre, which is a pretty large number for a hayfield. We also did another method, which is a defined search, where you lay out a 1 meter square and essentially take all the vegetation out of that and look for slugs. And then you also dig down about 10 centimeters and sift through all the soil and count all the slugs. This method generally has more variation just because juvenile slugs are incredibly difficult to separate from the soil. But we get about an estimation of about 250,000 slugs per acre, which is still, a very high number for a pest load. So we've learned that slug populations are huge. And so one of the things that's important for our integrated pest management approach is trying to figure out where the slugs are coming from, right? Where are they? Are they residing in a glen? Are they residing in the lawn? And are they migrating into our garden or into our fields? Or are they necessarily in our garden and our fields? Is that where our slug population is? And then it's important to think about limiting the mobility of the slugs. And this is one of the long-term factors of integrated pest management. If we can put in a wall or a long-term barrier that we don't really have to work at to maintain, it's going to keep our slug numbers down and our damage down. It's important to remember that slugs are limited by water, most of all, light next, and temperature. So some things that definitely do work. And electric fences have been around for quite a while for managing slugs. This is what we use in the lab if we want to contain a slug where we're treating it with a pesticide or some sort of environmental condition. It's different than your moose fence. 2 wires, 1 wire is positive, 1 wire is negative. It's a direct current, so it's a DC, not an AC, and it's a much, much lower volt. So we're talking 3 to 9 volts. Often a 9-volt battery wired to the 2 wires works well. The important thing to think about with these electric fences is the wires, the slug needs to contact both wires in order to be shocked. And so your wires need to be close enough based on the slugs that you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with gray garden slugs, they're a very small slug, and so your wires need to be very close to each other. If you're dealing with the black slugs, which are a much larger slug, you can be sloppier with your wires. But all the slugs seem to respond to similar voltage ranges in a reaction, and they won't cross these. We often recommend putting these on a vertical surface because slugs are slow to react sometimes. And so if they're on a horizontal surface, the slug may just sit there and electrocute itself. And these kind of fences where we're working with the direct current don't actually draw any energy unless there's a reaction going on, right? So there's no current being pulled from that battery unless a slug is actively being shocked or a piece of vegetation is crossing it or something. And so it functions very much like your regular electric fence. But because there's no current being drawn, a battery can last for quite a long period of time. This is a picture at my house where I've just ran, a copper wire on our raised bed around our strawberries, and I usually get, 2 to 3 months of usage out of a 9-volt battery, depending on the slug activity. So, this can be a very sustainable means of controlling slugs if you have a high-value crop. However, it's not going to protect your entire field. There are commercial options out there. This is a picture of what's called a commercial snail tape. It was developed for the escargot industry. Its availability varies, I would say. Sometimes you can find it on Amazon. Sometimes you can find it in other places. It seems to always be available wholesale, so you can buy it off of Alibaba, but you got to buy like 100 meters of the stuff, which may work if you wanted to surround a field with this stuff. It works the exact same way. This is just essentially a flexible electrical tape, kind of like that mesh tape you would see with a conventional electric fence, just developed for running both an AC or both a positive and a negative. We've done experiments with copper band fencing because we're always asked about this. This is probably one of the most popular internet fence barrier options out there. Studies from Hawaii found copper band fencing to be very effective. It needed to be about 2 inches, but they found it to be 100% effective. Studies from Europe found that copper bands just sort of slowed down the slugs. But if you're only given a certain period, slugs are most active at night. If they're only coming out for a few hours at night because of your short night period, that expansion of time that it takes for a slug to want to cross that barrier is enough to prevent damage. When they ran it out into the field, it took them about 14 hours to cross in the lab, cross the copper band. And when they, expanded their experiments out to the field, they found very few actually crossed. About 30% of the slugs crossed the copper band. We did some experiments a couple of years ago with raised beds and copper bands. And for our experiments with, lettuce as a bait, the copper bands had no effect. Unfortunately, our gray garden slugs that we had here cruised right over it like it wasn't there, unfortunately. So give or take, it's something you can think about trying. Like I said before, slugs are variable, slugs are adaptable, and environments change. Our experiments have shown that it doesn't seem to be too effective up here in Alaska, but it has been effective elsewhere. We started looking into metal fencing a couple of years ago. There's a number of internet companies that will sell essentially bent metal fencing for controlling slugs. The attractiveness of this kind of fencing is it's long lasting. It is really minimal upkeep. So you essentially install this piece of metal and the slugs don't cross it. It sounds like a great idea. There's lots of speculation on the internet from the companies that are making this stuff as to why this works. One of them is that slugs don't climb, which many people who run greenhouses and have a slug issue will tell you is absolutely false. Slugs are actually very adept climbers. Slugs can't get around the lip. This is also false. Like I just mentioned, slugs are very adept climbers. They can get right over a thin, narrow band, no problem. And they're, and then another argument is that slugs don't like the metal that they're making the fence out of. And there may be something to this. Like I just mentioned with the copper, some slugs don't seem to like copper or they're hesitant to cross it. And so it slows them down. It could be the case with whatever the material is that the manufacturer is making the fence out of. We did run some trials with these. This is a picture of what the trials look like. They're like miniature controlled, miniature raised beds, essentially, with a bait on the inside, an open area around it, and then slugs on the outside, and whether they could get to the bait inside. This was with a single bend fence, so like essentially just a 90-degree piece of flashing, like you might put on the edge of your house. It was painted metal. It was 2 inches by 2 inches. And there was no difference in the number of slugs crossing the metal. So they were very capable of cruising up to this 90-degree bent metal and going right around it. On a recommendation from actually a conversation I had with a master gardener last year, was he mentioned another type of bent metal fence, which had multiple bends to it, and asked about it. I had not heard about it, so I did some Google searching and found there are products out there with multiple bends to the metal fencing. So this year we did an experiment with what I'll call a 2-bend fence. So essentially you can see the shape of the fence there in the middle of the slide. It essentially was your vertical plane, and then about, kind of like a house, a 45-degree angle coming down for about 2 inches, and then a 1/2 inch bend back in to create kind of like a 270-degree wraparound. Created 9 different raised beds. So 3 had the double bent fence, 3 had just a straight galvanized fence. So this is all made out of galvanized metal this year. And then obviously the control was no fence. It was a managed area. So this is hayfield that's just being mowed around it, similar to how you would mow your lawn. Each plot got 16 plants, or kale plants this year, planted in it. Half were red Russian, half were a dwarf blue variety. And then the plants were, maintained. So we weeded around them, watered them if we needed be, which actually we didn't really need to. Plants weren't planted until the first week in July. So every morning for 2 weeks, we got up, counted the number of slugs at like 6 a.m. to see how many slugs were hanging around our plots. And we see not a noticeable difference. So this is a good sign showing that there isn't a preference for slugs, clinging to the side of the metal fences or something like that. They're not functioning as an attractant. But when we look at the number of slugs that actually made it into our plots, we see a drastic reduction. So this is the average daily slugs that we're finding, but also the total number of slugs. So only 8 slugs in the entire 2 weeks that we were counting made it into those double bent metal plots. So that's a really great reduction when you look at the 670 that were counted in the control plots. Now, there is fewer slugs crossing the straight galvanized fence. So this is implying that, or giving us some inclination that maybe that galvanized material itself is functioning as somewhat of a barrier to the slugs. So we're getting a similar number outside, far fewer inside. So it does seem like the fence is working. Like I mentioned before, just finding slugs is not an indication of damage. So count all the leaves that are available on the plants, and we see a similar number of leaves. So plants are growing similarly inside our control plots as they are in either one of our fence plots. But when we look at the damage, as to be expected, because we have far more slugs, we're seeing far more damaged leaves. So we're seeing, we only saw 9 damaged leaves in our double bent fence plots, at 150 in the single fence or non-bent fence plot, and about 275 in our damaged leaves. So similar number of total leaves, but much more damage when we have a higher number of slugs. Rolling into harvest, so harvestable leaves are larger leaves. So that was the total number of leaves. And anybody who's raised kale knows that there's a lot of smaller leaves that the plant will put out, especially in the beginning of the year, to get growing. And these often hang around the bottom of the plant, but these wouldn't be leaves that you would harvest to eat. So we also decided to look at the number of harvestable leaves. These are where the plant has grown big enough and the leaves are big enough that we would, cut these, put them into a bunch, potentially sell them. We don't see a difference in the number of harvestable leaves. So even though the slugs, the control plots and the non-bent fence are seeing more damage because they have more slugs, we're still seeing those plants producing similar numbers of harvestable leaves. Again, as to be expected, we're seeing a lot more damage to those harvestable leaves because we're seeing more damage generally overall. Again, we only saw a few, leaves with damage in the double bent plots. But if you look at the number of total damaged leaves in the non-bent fence to the control plots with no fence, there's only about 20 something leaf difference. And so what we're seeing is that there's more slugs means more damage, which means less harvest, but that the number of slugs that make it into the plot or the number of slugs that you're finding in your garden is not necessarily going to be proportional to the amount of damage that you're seeing. So essentially a few slugs can do quite a bit of damage. If we look at the economic costs, and these are highly, speculative, but we make some assumptions that a bunch is about a half a pound, and that's about 12 leaves. A bunch at our local market sells for between $4 and $5. So we went on the low end with $4. If we were a wise grower and we managed to catch every one of these slug damaged leaves and put them in a bunch, you can see that we would lose, with no fence, we'd lose about 9 bunches. With the non-bent fence, we'd lose about 6 bunches. And with the bent fence, we'd lose a single bent. If we were a really sloppy grower and we were just harvesting and not paying attention to the slug damage, and the assumption being made that somebody at a farmer's market is picking up a bunch, they turn it over and they see a slug damaged leaf, they're not going to buy that bunch, you potentially lose your entire crop. But that's also very speculative as well. I don't think that's realistic. Another question that we are often asked by growers, which we didn't have any data on, was whether the use of plastic mulch would increase slug numbers. We know that slugs like refuges, right? That's why we use those refuge traps to see if we have slug damage. So we did an experiment to look at row covers as a possible refuge. For people that aren't familiar with plastic mulch or row covers, these are often like a plastic covering you put over a bed. There's often a drip line irrigation underneath it. There's holes in the plastic. The plants grow out of it. It keeps the soil warmer. It maintains moisture better underneath that plastic mulch, reduces, essentially wind evaporation. But it also prevents, a weed barrier. So you're doing far less effort to maintain that weeds. But the question is, are you increasing your slug count and potentially causing more damage that way? So the experiment was laid out with 3 15-foot mulch beds, 3 15-foot open beds, and then 15 feet of buffer in between each plot. Each plant got 16 kale plants. For whatever reason, in this case, the germination of the red Russian was really lousy. And so there was a minimum of 1 plant per hole anyway on all of these. It was watered with a drip line. And then we monitored again these for 2 weeks every morning, and also did additional harvest damage just like the other one, and additional damage estimates as well as harvest numbers. When we look at the daily slug number, so this would be the number of slugs that we see in the plots, again, not a noticeable difference. So this is telling us that early in the morning, the slugs that are migrating onto our rows of crops is very similar whether we're using plastic mulch or not. But when we pull back that plastic mulch a little later in the day to see if the slugs are actually using that as a refuge, we see a great increase in the number of slugs. So we're finding on average about 27 slugs per plot. So these are slugs that are residing in the plot throughout the day. So the short answer of, are slugs using plastic mulch as a refuge is yes, they do appear to be using that. So then the question is, do more slugs mean more damage? And this was kind of an interesting group of data, and it probably, we don't have a full interpretation of this, unfortunately, and this falls back to the limitation of, we only had three plastic mulch plots and 3 open plots. So we don't have quite enough data to really tease this out. But we do see that control plants, for whatever reason, were producing more leaves. They weren't harvestable leaves, but these were more leaves, right? And we see that the mulch plants had more damaged leaves. So this is kind of implying that the incidence of slugs, the fact that we had maybe more slugs hiding in that refuge, was causing more damage to the plastic mulch, but also maybe reducing the growth potential because our control plants were showing more leaves. But when we look at our harvest numbers, we don't see a noticeable difference. There's not a significant difference. But there is a lot of variation in the plastic mulch plots. So these plants grew all over the place. And I think part of that was dealing with those red Russian plants that were late to germinate and it didn't really grow very vigorously. So, essentially our harvestable numbers were really variable. Again, though, if we look at the total number of what we're getting out of these plots for a harvest, if we look at our total harvestable leaves, we see that our mulch plants actually produced more leaves for the number of plants, right? We have 820 versus 608, which is quite a big increase, which is actually what we kind of expect from the plastic mulch. And you could definitely see that the plants that were grown under the plastic were larger plants and did seem to produce larger leaves. With more harvestable leaves, you're going to see more damage, which we see here as well. Falling back to the same assumptions, we did see more harvest damage from this lot than we did see with the fence lot, which is, they're in two different places on the farm, so that could be the case. If we removed the total number, all of our damaged leaves as bunches, we would lose about 13 bunches in our control plots versus 23 bunches in our plastic mulch plots, but then our plastic mulch plots produce more bunches. So there is a difference between our control and our total leaves, but it's not a great difference. And we don't really have enough data to really tease out exactly what that loss is between these two varieties. So, the conclusion here is that, yes, there are more slugs hiding under the plastic mulch. Does that number of slugs seem to incur more damage on your plants? Yes, but is that damage something you should be concerned about as far as losing you money in a harvest? And the answer to that is, I don't know. We don't have enough data for that to give you a yes or no, but it's something that you could potentially be thinking about when you're thinking about what you're planting under plastic mulch and its slug susceptibility. Another thing, and this is drawing back to our integrated pest management approach, if you look at, this is an aerial photo of those plots. Again, they were maintained similar to the other ones, so weeded around the plants, but then just simply mowed. We had way more slugs near that glen. And this is because that glen is a huge source population for slugs on the farm. They're obviously migrating from the glen into our field there. So, again, understanding where our source population could be very valuable for maintaining or for trying to prevent slugs from getting to our crops. We're often asked, what are commercial growers doing? And this is, I can only speak for the farms that I visited in the valley. The truth is they're using a dry buffer. Essentially, they're tilling around their plants, usually whatever, 6 or 8 feet, whatever their rototiller happens to be. They're often doing this for weed damage initially, but what this creates is essentially a dry zone that the slugs don't want to cross. Remember, slugs are limited by water, then light, then temperature. A dry open area kind of checks all those boxes, right? It's going to be drier in a tilled area. It's not going to provide the cover of vegetation, and it's going to be warmer than other areas. So all three of those things reduce a slug wanting to migrate across a tilled barrier. This year we grew potatoes where we had tilled around the potato plants, and we grew potatoes where we simply mowed around the potato plants. And what we saw was that 96% of the mowed plants had damage, whereas only 25% of the tilled plants had any slug damage. But I really want to point out that the slug damage to the mowed plants was so much greater than the slug damage to the tilled plants. And this is, an artifact of how we were collecting data. Essentially, it was a presence absence. So do you see slug damage? Yes. Do you, whatever. But these plants in the mowed field were essentially skeletonized by the end of the year. The slugs were all over them, totally hammering them. Whereas in our tilled plots, you would find like 1 or 2 leaves with slug damage. We also saw very little slug damage to the potatoes in the tilled plots, where we saw quite a bit of slug damage to the potatoes in the mowed plots, which is to be expected as well. So what are commercial growers doing? They're putting in a buffer. If we look back at our aerial photo, putting in perhaps a tilled buffer band around this plot, separating the glen from where our field is, may be a good idea, and it may be a pretty simple measure we could do to reduce the number of slug damage. So that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about building our way out of this problem. So back to our slug damage prevention realization. After a couple of years of experimenting, we're finding things that are working, right? So it's important to figure out how many slugs you have, where they're coming from, and can you build your way out of it? Like I just mentioned, is it possible to shift things to a raised bed, get some of these double bent metal fences, and put some of that in to separate the slugs from your high value crops? Could you put in a simple xeric pathway, like adding gravel and changing mulch to gravel, something that stays drier longer if you're not in the tilling operation, or adding a tillable area? Last year, I talked a bit about, numerous pesticides and some of the experiments we've been doing with contact pesticides. And this is another thing I'm not really talking about today, but it's important to realize that all of the contact pesticides for slugs cause the slug to release mucus. And so if you spray a slug with essential oil or ammonia or something like that, it is throwing out a crap ton of mucus, and your plant will have a bunch of mucus on it. And this is something to think about, especially as a commercial grower. If you're spraying your lettuce with this and you go to sell lettuce, it's got a big wad of mucus on it, which may not be as noticeable necessarily instantly as a hole through it from a slug eating on it, but it's certainly going to be noticeable when the person tries to wash it, because mucus doesn't wash away easily. Also, the limitations, like we found out last year with our slug data and pesticides, is that if you have a really high slug load, it doesn't matter, because pesticides don't really work, because there's so many slugs migrating in. You kill the ones that you're seeing, and more just migrate in. However, there is data showing that conventional pesticides do seem to work. And so this would be like your metaldehyde and copper sulfate, the bait pesticides. And so what they do show is that they don't necessarily kill the slugs, but they reduce the slugs from feeding. And so if you have a high value crop and you're dealing with a really bad slug problem, there is good evidence that using one of these more conventional bait pesticides do reduce the damage and will increase yield. But again, this is all part of that integrated pest management approach about how bad is the problem? Do I need to take action? What is the value? What are my losses? So with that, I am pretty much out of what we did this year, but I will take any other additional questions. Again, if you are finding slugs throughout the state, please feel free to report them to alaskapestreporter.org. We also have a whole slug webpage on there with tips on taking pictures and some links to slug biology. You can look at those maps on where we're finding them and see if they're in your neighborhood and what your neighbors have been reporting. You can always send me an email or give me a call. I'm always willing to talk with slugs. But as you can see, slugs are a pretty complex questions, and sometimes are complex pest. And it often takes, variable solutions to succeed with the slugs. And with that, yeah, I'm ready for questions if we got any.